Once upon a time, a man and his daughter Vasilisa lived in a hut deep in the forest, taking care of Vasilisa's dying mother. On her deathbed, she gave Vasilisa one last gift, a little doll. "Take good care of this doll and never show it to anyone," she said. "If ever anything bad happens to you, give the doll something to eat and ask its advice. It will help you out in all your troubles." And giving Vasilisa a last parting kiss, the sick woman died. Her father remarried soon after, hoping to give his daughter a new mother and to turn her two daughters into Vasilisa's stepsisters. But they were cruel and vicious and treated Vasilisa horribly. One cold night, when the last light in the hut went out, the stepsisters sent Vasilisa out into the forest to fetch light from Baba Yaga's hut. As she trudged through the forest, she saw first a rider clad in white at the dawning of the new day, then one clad in red as the sun beat down heavy over the forest, and finally a black rider as she arrived to Baba Yaga's hut in the dead of night. The fence round the hut was made of human bones and crowned with human skulls. The gate was made from the bones of men's legs, the bolts were the bones of men's arms, and the lock a set of sharp teeth. Baba Yaga made a bargain with Vasilisa. Clean the house, separate poppy seeds from grains of soil, prepare a meal fit for 12 people, and then she would have her help. If she failed, Baba Yaga would eat Vasilisa alive. Vasilisa worked all day to complete these chores, but the exhaustion became too much for her. So she fed her little doll, and it told her to go to sleep. When she awoke, the chores were done, and Baba Yaga could find nothing to complain of. So she gave Vasilisa a lantern made of human skull full of lit coals to take back to her family, and sent her on her way. When she returned, she found that in her absence, her family had been unable to light a fire without her, despite her being gone for days. Any candle or flame brought in from outside would be snuffed out as soon as it crossed the hut's threshold. But when Vasilisa brought the skull lantern in, the light was so great it burned her stepmother and stepsisters to ash. And once the fire was lit, Vasilisa buried the skull in the forest, so as no innocent souls would be harmed by its fire. Vasilisa and her father lived on in that little hut, but she always kept that doll right there in her pocket, should she ever need it again, and thus did they live for many a day, and wait for us all to come for a stay. Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight, specifically Dead by Daylight's most popular killer, known simply as Anna or the Huntress. It's been too long since I made a video like this. My last DBD lore video was over a month ago, on the other side of January, the Hell Month. So I thought it's high time to go back to basics, and I mean that in every sense of the word, because Huntress is, I think, proof that sometimes in design, less really can be more. I've gone on long tirades about how brilliantly, deliciously complex many of my favourite characters are, but with complexity comes lots of potential points of failure where a character might not quite land right. As a result, sometimes it's the right call to just calm it down a bit and go for something that simply works. And Huntress just works. It's hard to know where to begin talking about this, but I'm going to start by looking at her base lore and seeing where she comes from, and what makes the Huntress tick, so to speak. The Huntress's inspirations are what you'd call subtle. She's clearly Dead by Daylight's take on the Eastern European mythological figure known as the Baba Yaga, with some classic Mars slasher tropes to tie it all together and give the myth a more human face. But before we dive too deep into that, I want to set the record straight on something. I hear a lot of people using terms like mind of a child to refer to Anna. I think there's a lot wrong with that on so many different levels. It shows a degree of disdain for people who grew up outside of civilization, because Anna's story is not entirely fictitious. People living on their own in the woods happens in real life too, Just because they don't conduct themselves like we would in a big and bustling society, doesn't mean they're necessarily underdeveloped or lesser than us. They're just different. Anna is clearly intelligent. You don't survive for decades in the hostile environment of the forest without some level of cunning and intelligence. In her own environment, Anna's adjusted incredibly well. She keeps house, can still understand Russian, and as her tome suggests, remembers enough about her mother's stories to understand the rare few people that she does encounter. She's got the awareness of an adult, and should be treated as such. But yeah, back on topic. Huntress was a nice breath of fresh air after the killer immediately preceding her, the Doctor, brought a lot of complexity in a lot of different ways. His power was the first to introduce new and exclusive status effects, messed with the survivor's perception elements of the game like skill checks that had never been touched before, and his visual design and lore was heavy with real life history and allusions to real life atrocities. Huntress is much simpler, at least in the visual design department. She's a big beefy slasher in a white mask who prowls the forest in search of prey. No crazy mutations or quirks of biology, no overly elaborate weapons or power fueled by weird entity magic. She's just a big lady with a big axe who throws little axes. It's not a terribly complex formula, but it's a good one, and it's one that resonates with a lot of players, at least judging by how incredibly popular she is. That being said, I'm not one of those players, as you can probably tell by the background footage in this video, because I'm playing like total dog shit. So to get the perspective of a seasoned Huntress player, I decided to ask one, and she's here with us today. So everybody welcome Moody Joe. She's a streamer and former competitive player who mains Huntress, so I asked her what she thought, and she had this to say.
Hello friends, my name is Moody, and I'm of course a Huntress main. She's my favorite killer in the game and has such a simple yet complex power to her. Let's go more in depth about her. When it comes to Huntress, it's important to bear in mind that she's a product of a simpler time. Aside from Doctor, every killer released this early in Dead by Daylight's lifespan had a pretty simple power that could be explained in just a few words. Myers stalks you and then stabs you, Hag places traps and teleports to them when triggered, and Nurse blinks through walls and hits you out of nowhere.
Hello there.
Huntress kept it pretty simple too. You just wind up a hatchet and then throw it at the survivor. Quite away from the essay-length power descriptions we have now. But by resolving to make Huntress their first true ranged killer, Behavior managed to do something quite clever. They made the first killer who incorporated mechanical skills from other games, unless you count looking at people as a skill. However, making the first killer with a precise aim component presented some unique design challenges. When loops are designed around killers who have to close the gap, how do you balance a killer who doesn't? They took the simplest solution, just making her a bit slower and forcing her to wind up her hatchet before firing. How do you stop her from spamming them forever? Make her have to reload at lockers. How do you stop survivors from just holding W away from her without making her a stealth killer? Give her a lullaby to warn people when she's close without telling them how close she really is. Every design element is worn down to the bare minimum needed to solve the practical issues of a ranged killer. There's nothing really fancy that comes out of her. It just comes down to, I want to throw hatchets at people. How do we make it work? And yet because of the lack of unnecessary restrictions, it meant Huntress players have a lot more flexibility and freedom to express their skill than most other killers. That is a huge draw for her, bringing in skills from first-person shooters without the gimmicks or restrictions that would come with later attempts of a ranged killer like Deathslinger or Trickster. By keeping it as simple as they could while still innovating into a new type of power design, Behavior created what could possibly be their most timeless killer. Huntress has always been strong, popular, and generally well-liked, for everything except her hitboxes anyway, and offers a way in for FPS players that allows skill expression at all levels of play. Her popularity is so great that she's inspired a clutch of other ranged killers like Deathslinger and Trickster, and a ton of semi-ranged killers like Artist, Plague, Pinhead, and even the Twins. But sometimes there's elegance in simplicity, and less can be more.
Honestly, I couldn't agree more. Huntress is a very elegantly made killer, and that goes to her visual design just as much as it does for her gameplay. You know what? Despite how Trapper is very obviously inspired visually by Jason Voorhees, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that the closest spiritual successor to Jason in Dead by Daylight is actually Huntress. Yeah, Trapper's got the machete and everything, but in every other way Anna embodies the idea of Jason Voorhees. She's deeply territorial, lives in the wilderness on her own, does not kill children, fends for herself after the death of her mother, and has been mythologized by the locals. Hell, while Jason did use a machete as a safe weapon and even bear traps sometimes, he's no stranger to an axe either. But the elegant part is that, unlike Trapper, for whom the visual similarities to Jason are so hard to ignore it's almost obnoxious, Huntress's allusions to Jason and the other slashers he inspired are much more subtle, to the point that they'd be easily missed if you weren't looking for them. Don't get me wrong, it's not exactly subterranean in depth, but it's less on the nose. While Trapper feels like he's behaviour's own character, wearing a cheap Jason costume, Huntress feels like she's built on top of Jason's skeleton. It's why her design clicks so well with so many of DBD's horror enthusiasts. She's the game's truest original slasher. And much like most cinematic slashers, the Huntress' story only really makes sense if you don't think about it too much. Like, as much as kidnapping little girls to adopt them, only for them to starve death under her care, is very sad and defines her character a bit more, it doesn't really make sense if you think about it. Literally, the only thing Anna knows how to do with any level of proficiency is survive in the forest. And given her fond memories of her mother, you'd think she'd be able to put two and two together and realise that the reason these children keep dying is because she's keeping them prisoner and not feeding or sheltering them properly. The lifelong survivalist doesn't know how to keep people alive. I just don't buy that. I think it's where a lot of the misconceptions about Anna's intelligence come from. But it just doesn't make sense with everything else that we know about her. If they kept the fates of the little girls she kidnapped ambiguous, I think that would have had more or less the same effect without leading to this logical snarl. If we didn't fully know why she was taking the little girls, instead left up to the reader to infer whether or not she was keeping them alive, and if so, why? As I said, less would probably be more, because her drive for motherhood would still be obvious, but obscuring that information a little would play up how the locals mythologise her and not lead to too many difficult questions. This is also where I think her tome made a couple of mistakes, the biggest by far being the use of her perspective. Like, Anna isn't a complicated person, and she does everything with a clear intention. So I'm not sure A Lovely War needed to be written from her point of view to get a good sense of who she is and why she does what she does. One thing we've learned from these classic slashers like Jason Voorhees, from whom the Huntress is a direct descendant, is that their impact as a force of power and terror often comes from the tension and dramatic irony of their audience knowing more about the danger their helpless victims are in than the victims themselves. Despite this, many horror movies such as Halloween often give us the point of view of the killer instead of the victim, to extend that sense of helplessness to the viewer. You're stuck behind the eyes of death itself and you have to watch powerlessly as the victim dies, unable to hear your warnings from the other side of the television screen. But that rather loses its impact when the killer's exact thought processes are spelled out in plain English like they are in A Lovely War. This methodology worked for the hillbilly in his tome, specifically because the brutality of his actions are a stark contrast with the vulnerabilities and tortured psyche of the man named Boy. But there's really nothing to A Lovely War because the entire process is Anna thinks the thing, Anna does the thing, the soldiers do the big die. It'd be like if the death of Judith Myers in Halloween was narrated by Michael's thoughts playing over it. It would completely kill the tension by distracting us from the brutality of the violence and the tension of the atmosphere. I firmly believe that the tome story should have been told from the perspective of one of the soldiers, not from Anna herself, to preserve that narrative minimalism and shroud her in the menace of the unknown. It's kinda similar to the show not tell problem I noticed in other stories by behaviour, like The Artist for example. It just tells us what she's thinking, instead of allowing us to discern what she's thinking through her actions. It's an understandable mistake for sure. The Huntress is an incredibly popular and successful character, so delving more into who she is was obviously extremely tempting. But with the changing of the guard as new writers come in and out over the years, brought with it a change in how they wanted to frame the character. A change which I think was for the worse overall. If Anna's role in A Lovely War was measured by her impact on it, as opposed to giving her some internal monologue, would have affirmed the Huntress' identity as behaviour's answer to the white mask slashers of the 1980s. since all her interactions with the outside world are hostile, and she never talks to anyone. Giving her a voice when her actions speak louder than her words just feels like a waste of what she is. She's a cautionary tale, a grim, bloody fable that scares children in their beds and makes their parents bar their doors at night. And one of the reasons that works so well is because that legend is real. Well, there's no murderous manhunter in a rabbit mask throwing hatchets at people in real life, obviously, but that legend of a child-stealing woman lurking in the forests of Eastern Europe is told in real life, and it inspired much of the Huntress's lore and design. And I'm really glad I'm making this video now of all times, because thanks to a new Huntress cosmetic that was released with the mid-chapter, the presence of this real-life myth in the Huntress subtext has been dragged into, well, text. For those who don't know, the Baba Yaga is a supernatural creature in Eastern European folklore that commonly takes the form of an old woman, or sometimes a trio of them, that live in the wilderness, kind of like a witch. Depending on the region and the story in question, Baba Yaga can be the villain of the tale, usually attempting to cannibalize children, or the donor, a term used in classical storytelling that basically means the quest giver, the person who tests the hero and offers them something if they succeed. Think of the Lady of the Lake in the story of King Arthur as an example of a donor. If you ever read a fairy tale or a folk story with a wicked witch living in the woods, chances are there's a little bit of the Baba Yaga in there. The story of Hansel and Gretel, put to paper by the Brothers Grimm in 1812, is the most commonly known use of the trope, and it was readopted back to Russia in Vasilisa the Beautiful, a story in Alexander Afasniev's collection of Russian folk tales. And I'm just going to say this now. The Baba Yaga cosmetic is one of the best behaviour has ever made, because it perfectly captures the fractured mythology of the character and ties it to the framework of the Huntress. Afasniev's story, for example, mentions figures that recur in Baba Yaga mythology, who patrol her forest and wear garb the colours of their horses' coats. The White Rider appears at dawn and heralds the arrival of the day. The Red Rider appears at noon and heralds the ascendancy of the sun. And the Black Rider appears at dusk and heralds the arrival of the night. And guess what colours are predominant in the Baba Yaga skin? The cosmetic also shows off many of the quirks of the Baba Yaga myth. The chicken feet on the belt, for an example, is an allusion to the hut that she's supposed to live in that wanders around the forest on chicken legs. And the mask that creates the image of three faces reflects the version of the myth where the Baba Yaga are actually three witches instead of one. It was honestly made with a forensic focus on the myth, and it's combined with the new sound effects for her voice and lullaby that bring the character to life in a way that no other cosmetic has really done before. And one of the reasons it works so well is that it's not actually that far of a leap to go from the Huntress herself. It doesn't change her into something she isn't. It just discards the trappings of slasher tropes and decides to fully develop the Baba Yaga subtext that she always had. And yet it's also different enough to make it distinct because the Baba Yaga subtext was, like the Jason stuff I talked about earlier, pretty subdued. They kept it simple and that's what made it work. If the Baba Yaga mythology was woven too tightly around Huntress, this cosmetic wouldn't have been possible, because it would be too similar to her base design. The Huntress is the perfect display of why you don't need to go overboard with exhaustive character work or deep-rooted emotional turmoil to make an interesting and appealing character. She's got enough humanity to be more than just an emotionless killing machine, but her suffering is somewhat sidelined in favour of showcasing her impact on the world around her. Most Dead by Daylight killers struggle between being feared for their ruthlessness and unhinged brutality like the Clown and the Doctor, or loved and pitied for their ruthless backstories like the Twins and the Artist. This is especially a problem with female killers, who tend to be put through conga lines of trauma to wring out as much sympathy as they could, even if it damages the agency of the character to the point of bleakness fatigue. The Huntress manages to pull off both by not spending too long focusing on either the solitary slasher tropes or the idea of Anna as a mythological figure. In essence, the Huntress demonstrates that behaviour truly knows slasher horror as a concept, because that's effectively what all slashers are. Dark, modern fairy tales. They fulfill the same function. morality plays where the wicked are punished by an otherworldly force to be endured by the virtuous. And the Huntress is that otherworldly force, all knowledge of the woman under the mask lost to time, as her identity becomes secondary to her legend. To the families of the Russian villagers, she's the monster who slays men and steals daughters from their beds. She's a warning for children to get home before dark, because Baba Yaga will scoop you up and you'll never be seen again. She's literally the stuff of nightmares, a bedtime story, a lullaby for the dark. Right, so that's everything I had to say about Anna or the Huntress. Big thanks again to Moody for her takes on the Huntress. A link to her Twitch is in the description, where you can also find links to my Discord server, my Twitch, my Twitter, and my Patreon and Ko-fi links if you feel like this content deserves your money. I've wanted to make this video for ages and I'm really glad I got around to it because there's so much licensed stuff coming in the next few weeks. We've got both parts of the Sword Tome and the Ring reveal in a couple of weeks' time to review, so this is going to be a really crazy few weeks for me. Please do subscribe if you want to keep up with it. The next video I make might be on a slight delay because I am away for a while, but don't worry, I'll still be working even when I'm away, so be patient. As always, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Ta-ta for now.